Alright, I'm rolling. Wait, now I'm rolling.
The sequel to 300 is out. 300 Rise of an Empire.
And there's an interesting historical backstory to this. But I'm sure Zack Snyder, we're not really that surprised that he took a lot of liberties with history, so to speak, in the way that these events are portrayed.
The ecstasy of steel and flesh, sweat of muscle, and rage.
Well, I should say, in some ways, Zack Snyder, who directed the first one and produced this one, is very faithful to source material, but his source material is the Frank Miller comics, not history. And Frank Miller is not all that faithful to the source material. But you know, he's a comic book artist. That's allowed. He exaggerates things, creates caricatures, and actually he, I guess, angered a lot of present-day Iranians, descendants of the Persians, with his depiction of the ancient Persians in the first 300, because some of them had mutant goat heads and looked like monsters. And of course, Xerxes, the emperor, is 9 feet tall, and they found that, understandably,
and it's also portrayed as a very effete, effeminate.
Yep. It's like a 9-foot-tall, scary gay giant, basically, from Frank Miller's Strange Nightmares. And you know, oddly enough, I saw the first movie with a Russian woman who said it was the best movie she'd ever seen. But I think that kind of makes sense when you think about how much it looked like Russian propaganda posters. You know, the lantern-jawed inhuman beings hurling missiles and spears at each other. It sort of makes sense.
Well, I was curious about this because I happened into a Barnes & Noble a few weeks ago, and they were promoting 300, The Rise of an Empire. Of course, they had all these cross-promotional books about the set design and the history of the filming, along with actual historical books about the history of the Greek city-states, the wars between the Persian Empire and Athens and Sparta. And they, funny enough, they actually had Herodotus, the histories, and of course, during his time, history was very different conceptually from what we understand it to be today, which is a very accurate recording of events. If not objective, at least there's no willful distortions or misrepresentations, whereas Herodotus essentially blended mythology or quasi-mythology with actual recorded events. And I was wondering if this is what people are going to, this is how people are learning history now, by watching Zack Snyder films, which is kind of disturbing.
Leonidas and the brave 300 are dead.
Have I not given enough for your dream of a united Greece, Themistocles? A king, our husbands.
Avenge him.
And you know, I think not only do I think both 300 movies are awesome in their own bizarre way, but I think since they've done well, they could make a couple more 300 movies based on what we actually know about history. Themistocles, after, I hope I'm not giving away the movies, but it's history, so technically you should already know. But after the Battle of Salamis, Themistocles went back and became an important statesman in Athens, and eventually the others turned against him and drove him out of Athens, and he ended up allying with one of Xerxes' sons, who actually killed another of Xerxes' sons, blaming that second son for the murder of their father Xerxes. So I might actually be giving away the plot of 300 Part 3 and 300 Part 4 if they ever make those movies, but I think they should.
They should. In fact, they could have an entire franchise just devoted to the Persian, to the history of Greece, or the Greek city-states themselves and the wars between the Peloponnesian Wars. I mean, there's so much source material that they could take and distort and beyond all recognition.
Frank Miller, who did the 300 comics and The Dark Knight Returns about Batman, is also interested in the present-day clash of civilizations and political struggles, which is sort of interesting. He started out a hardcore leftist, which is most easily discerned, I think, from watching RoboCop 2 and RoboCop 3. We talked a little bit once before about the remake of RoboCop, but the sequels to the original were both written by Frank Miller, and they're both very left-wing. In fact, the third RoboCop movie features an explicit Marxist revolution with the good guys shouting that they're fighting not just against Omni Consumer Products Corporation, but against capitalist corporations everywhere, and RoboCop is on their side. So Frank Miller was a total lefty, but he started to develop an interest in Ayn Rand, who he explicitly thanked in one of his comics. And then after 9/11, some would say he snapped, but basically he underwent a major transformation, decided America was awesome, that his parents had tried to impart bourgeois values to him when he was young, and he should have listened to them more, and that he was terrified of the Islamic menace, basically. And he went on to do a comic book featuring a Batman-like character called Holy Terror, where that character is fighting off an army of Al-Qaeda assailants who are invading a city that looks a lot like New York City. And originally he was actually going to do it with Batman, but DC Comics got a little spooked and didn't want to.
Well, I think that's one of the ironies of the debate surrounding 300. It depicts a period that preceded the advent of Islam by 12, or approximately, I'd say 12 or 13 centuries. So this was, and Iranians or Persians, as some people like to be known, they don't. A lot of them really, it grates on them that they're lumped in with other Arabic-speaking cultures and parts of the Middle East that are much more firmly entrenched in the Islamic fold. You could actually say that Iran, the people of Iran, they're a lot more Western oriented and forward thinking in their outlook than almost all of the Middle East, with the possible exception of Turkey or Tunisia.
And at the same time, I'm sure Frank Miller was aware that people would see 300 as being in some ways analogous to the West versus East clash that was going on when the movie came out, certainly, which was 2007. And he wrote the comic back in the late 90s when Iran wasn't as much on people's radars, but the association by 2007 was inevitable in people's minds. And so perhaps we should mention to the viewer that not only are the Persians in 300 much older than Islam. As far as we know, Xerxes was probably a Zoroastrian, but we don't even know that for sure. By the way, Frank Miller has not only distorted history and culture, much as we love it, he's also distorted comics themselves, and I must say that even though I loved 300 and thought Sin City was okay, he's also responsible for one of the worst movies I've ever seen. The only one he directed solo was The Spirit, based on a superhero created by Will Eisner. Will Eisner's comics were fantastic and unusually realistic in some ways in their depiction of gritty urban environments way back in the 50s. The movie that Frank Miller made bears no resemblance to Will Eisner's work, at least visually and in tone, and looks an awful lot like Frank Miller comics, which would be great if he were doing his own stuff, but really it was an atrocity what he did to The Spirit. And I knew something was wrong when even the fanboys and nerds did not seem to be going to see the movie. It totally bombed at the box office, and like a lot of people, I tried using Movie Phone to figure out where I could see the movie, but I waited a couple of weeks before I tried going because I thought it was going to be bad, and I had to keep adjusting the how many miles out do you want to search function until I realized that even though we live in New York City, full of wonderful places like the Lockyard Bar where we are now in Brooklyn, I had to adjust the search field until it went to Eastern Connecticut before I could find a theater that was still showing The Spirit 2 or 3 weeks after it came out. So that was not a successful film.
I have to say, having watched it on cable television, it wasn't any more enjoyable, to be honest. It really was. I don't know if I'd use the word cinematic atrocity, but it was very. Do you think that could have potentially been a Phantom Menace moment when people rose up against
Frank Miller in general?
Yeah.
I think luckily for him, so few people saw it that it didn't really affect their impression of him much. Yet, perversely, I do think it'd be kind of cool if he got a chance to direct an adaptation of his own Dark Knight Returns Batman comic book someday.
I think we should just be thankful he's not making a sequel to The Spirit, a la Atlas Shrugged.
Did you say Allah?
Yes.
Oh, Allah, Atlas Shrugged. Okay, yeah.
Should we talk about another former member state of the Axis of Evil?
Oh.
Since I noticed you have a copy.
You mean North Korea? Which has been written about by our friend Michael Malice in the book Dear Reader.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This is a really interesting book by someone who actually visited North Korea. I'm not sure people are aware of this, but it's relatively simple to visit North Korea. It's not the same as Cuba or other sanctioned countries where traveling there directly is nearly impossible unless you're an academic or have some other extenuating reason to be there. You can actually go, if you so choose, go there with a tour group and be guided around by North Korean minders to the Juche Tower and all of the other wondrous testaments to Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-Il. Although I doubt you'll be able to leave Pyongyang for more than once or twice. They're not going to show you around the gigantic Kwali-So prison camps. If that's what you're going to see, you're probably going to be disappointed.
And one fascinating thing about the book Dear Reader is that Michael Malice did not base it on history so much as actual North Korean propaganda. So it's the whole hallucinatory life story of Kim Jong-Il as he would tell it himself to people who believed all of the North Korean propaganda, complete with him having strange superpowers and exaggerated intelligence. In that sense, it's a little bit like 300, where you're getting the cartoonish version of history, and indeed of a very militarized and tight-knit Spartan society in some ways.
Well, that's the interesting aspect of this book. It's a very depressing subject, and I think one of the things Michael Malice does is, as extraordinary as this is, he kind of humanizes the subject.
And you do feel like you're getting inside Kim Jong-il's head. It's almost like Michael Malice has written a Mein Kampf for the 21st century.
I don't know if that's the analogy you want to use. But yeah, it is impressive how he was able to translate the thoughts, or what you would assume to be the thoughts, of Kim Jong-il. Of course, Kim Jong-il only spoke in public once, so it's almost impossible to understand what he actually thinks. You have to delve into the ghost-written North Korean literature, which is an arduous march. Not to make light of.
It's interesting, by the way, that although even as skeptics about socialism or communism, we think of it as kind of a universalist and international philosophy. North Korea is very insular, and they make no bones about thinking that they have pure North Korean blood that must be preserved, or they would simply say Korean blood that must be preserved, and they are very suspicious of all outsiders. It's extremely insular in almost more of a fascist unity of the tribe way than you would expect from a Karl Marx. They've transformed the philosophy.
They've definitely transmuted the philosophy to a point where it's not recognizable. I don't even think Marxism is in the last time that the Korean constitution was updated. I don't even think Marxism or communism was included. And there is a xenophobic streak. But the interesting part is, I think that applies to the entire Korean peninsula. People in South Korea as well are very, and there's an author in Korea, an American professor in Korea who wrote a book by the title of The Cleanest Race, I believe, which delves into the embedded xenophobia in North Korea and how it's reinforced by the government. But Korean people in general are very, speaking of people on the Korean Peninsula, are very xenophobic. But the difference is people in South Korea are actually exposed to media and outside influences.
Speaking of fear of cultural assimilation, I got unfriended on Facebook just recently by a woman who was enraged that I think it's okay if artists wear Native American headdresses without actually being Native Americans. And there's been a big upsurge lately in left-wingers getting extremely angry if anyone seems to be borrowing things from other cultures or exploiting or appropriating bits of the culture. Whereas it seems to me like everyone does this all the time, and it's not always an insult, and it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, I remember the Maori of New Zealand, some of them tried to sue Bionicles toys at one point years ago because the background story of the Bionicles robots is partly inspired by Maori mythology. But I mean, if you start down that road, we're going to have to get angry at every Thor movie because it's stealing from the Scandinavians.
And I guess the New Zealand All Blacks, they'll have to stop doing the haka before every game, since there are some people on that rugby squad who aren't Maori.
So I actually had a total of 4 people really Facebook unfriend me, an unprecedented wave, because hardly anybody
over this issue
hardly anybody ever gets upset with me about anything. But I figure I lost that friend who's a big anime fan, which you'd think would make her more sympathetic to cultural interweaving, and then a pal of hers who also into the anime and likes roller derby. You'd think she could handle some rough and tumble conflict and political disagreement. A guy who's a TV critic, who also you think might be used to this sort of thing, and a cinematographer named Adam Jones. If you're out there watching, Adam, I mean, come on, man. All I'm saying is it's okay to make movies like 300.
What is he noted for?
Only thing I've noticed was that there was a YouTube clip of him talking to one of his friends in a car. He's probably done more than that. I don't mean to insult Adam Jones, nor the Native Americans who
you don't want to deprecate his accomplishments.
Who definitely got a raw deal from our white ancestors. Not denying that. And if a musician today wears a Native American headdress, I'm not suggesting that should be a prelude to digging up the bones of Native Americans and urinating on them or something. I mean, that would be horrible and wrong. But sometimes imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
But a typical Ivy League prank, probably.
Well, yeah, okay. It could happen, and I would totally disapprove of that. That's obviously meant to be insulting. But a little bit of imitation, whether it's 300 showing Greeks as outsized superheroes, or the occasional dancer or musician wearing a Native American headdress, isn't the worst thing in the world. Or at least that's what Todd Seavey and Gerard Perry in our cultural reviews are inclined to think. Thanks.
See you next time.